Welcome to this fourth lesson in the book of First Kings. We're covering chapters 9 through 12, and we'll be looking at the latter part of King Solomon's reign over Israel and move on to the end of his reign. In 1 Kings 9 through 10, an overview of these chapters, we see that Solomon's court is described as all glitter and glory. There are descriptions of all things that were acquired and built. There are references to Solomon's fame and the places that he sent to and received goods from. Their quantities are most likely exaggerated. The writer does not recall these events in the exact order either, but it's more as though he is reminiscing about what was done during the time of Solomon as their ruler. The overall impression you receive for the first half of Solomon's reign is that he was an extraordinarily gifted ruler. Just as one might expect from the account of the first revelation to him from God back in 1 Kings chapter 3, where Solomon had his dream and he asked God for wisdom. And so his God-given wisdom brought him untold riches, power, and honor, as well as the wisdom that he asked for. Solomon undertook some significant public constructions, including, of course, building the temple, the palace complexes, and the Milo, which is a word that probably means a kind of terrace structure. Storage cities were built, fortifications around the kingdom were built, and of course, military installations for protection. And he reportedly built whatever he desired in Jerusalem, Lebanon, and all of his domain. Solomon was able to carry out these projects through a combination of power and administrative know-how. His labor force came from a permanent levy on foreign slaves in his domain. If you go back and read in 1 Kings chapter 9, you will see that the various tribes that were still within Israel were being submitted to slavery, and they were part of his labor force. Israel's laborers also were drafted for 3 months each from the northern tribes. And of course, the warriors, the soldiers, were all under a trusted corps of his officers. Solomon engaged in all sorts of diplomatic deals, international trade, and other foreign ventures. He attended to his public religious duties, offering sacrifices at the central sanctuary 3 times a year, fulfilling the law as required in Deuteronomy chapter 16, verses 16 and 17. And this is what it says in Deuteronomy. Quote, "Each year every man in Israel must celebrate these 3 festivals: the festival of unleavened bread, the festival of harvest, and the festival of shelters. On each of these occasions, all men must appear before the Lord your God at the place he chooses. But they must not appear before the Lord without a gift for him. All must give as they are able, according to the blessings given to them by the Lord your God." And so Solomon fulfilled this duty 3 times a year. We always hear about the story of Queen Sheba, definitely depicted in all the movies. You can't miss that. She's about as famous as Cleopatra. So why does this attention, so much attention given to this story of the Queen of Sheba coming to visit Solomon? Well, it's probably for several reasons, including that now Solomon is a great force and he's recognized in the political arena of foreign policies around the Mediterranean. The queen also brought considerable items for trade, and the hard questions that it says she posed were probably having to do with political situations and trade agreements between the nations. Once again, reminding us that Israel does not live in isolation. There are many foreign countries around Israel, and there are political relations with these countries. When we saw or read the story of the Queen of Sheba coming to see Solomon, it says that she comes from Ophir. So the word Ophir means to go south or southward. So in this story, the Queen of Sheba came from a land of Ophir, which was from the south, from Israel southward, somewhere into Africa. And another word that is used several times is Tarshish. And the word Tarshish means to go west or westward. We know in the book of Jonah, Jonah was trying to run away from God and not fulfill God's request to go to a particular place. So he set out for Tarshish to get away from God, which just means he got on a ship and he went westward to get away. This reminds me of a couple of other words, Oriental and Occidental, which seem to be politically incorrect at this time. But I remember as a youth that the word Oriental just meant to come from the East or from Asian countries. And to be Occidental meant to be in the West. So they just meant East and West. But a lot of negative connotations have been added to these two words. But so it's they're directional words. In other words, Ophir meaning southward and Tarshish meaning westward, and Oriental meaning eastward and Occidental meaning westward. So the second half of Solomon's reign, we see that there begins to be some issues with his judgment. There's the danger of his intermarriage with the foreign women, and that causes deviation from the worship of the one God, God alone. Solomon created shrines for his many wives, and he worshiped with them at these shrines. The object of Solomon's love were these foreign women and their foreign gods, and he held fast to them. In other words, he did not discourage from worshiping to these foreign gods. As commanded, love the Lord your God with all your heart and with all your soul and with all your might, back in Deuteronomy 6, verse 5. The passages in chapters 9 and 10 show that Solomon was a ruler just like the kings of other nations, even surpassed them in all of his accumulation of wealth and horses, especially horses acquired from Egypt. He had clearly violated the Deuteronomic laws, and particularly Solomon had been unfaithful to the Lord by worshiping with these foreign gods. And from 1 Kings chapter 4, it says, in Solomon's old age, they, meaning his foreign gods, or foreign wives, turned his heart to worship other gods instead of being completely faithful to the Lord his God, as his father David had been. Solomon worshipped Ashtoreth, the goddess of the Sidonians, and Moloch, the detestable god of the Ammonites. In this way, Solomon did what was evil in the Lord's sight, and he refused to follow the Lord completely as his father David had done. Solomon's unfaithfulness is especially disconcerting because God had appeared to him twice, once graciously giving him the gifts of wisdom, and another time firmly reiterating that Solomon remained faithful to God. On account of Solomon's flagrant violation of this covenant, God promised to tear the kingdom from him and give it to one of his servants. So the first time God appeared to him in a dream early on, when he was newly crowned as the king, and when Solomon asked for wisdom, he was given wisdom plus riches. The second time God appeared to him in a dream was following the dedication of the temple, and there God told Solomon that he needed to be sure and remain within the rules of the laws of Deuteronomy and remain faithful and steadfast to God. But because he did not do that and instead followed the gods of his wives, he is now going to have part of his kingdom removed from his rulership, or the kingdom will be split upon his death. And one of his servants, interestingly, is one of the people that he has chosen for good qualities, that he was a master over other people. So he served in a high position as far as responsibility, and he would become one of the rulers of the northern tribes. So looking at the way this would be viewed from ancient times would be cause and effect. The undoing of Solomon's kingdom is presented by listing his various enemies and some of the confrontations between them. And there are also references to David and Joab, who had fought the same enemies in the past. The explanation for the aggression by those enemies is that Solomon has not been faithful and his kingdom will be taken away from him. Although because David's heart had remained faithful, not the entire nation would be taken from his royal family line. Instead, it would just be the 10 northern tribes and the 2 southern tribes, which are Judah and Benjamin. Benjamin being almost absorbed by Judah and often referred to as one tribe together. Okay, last week we looked at a video about the prophets and their calling, and this week let's take a look at the remaining time of this video. Seemed like everyone liked it a lot last week, so we'll see what else.
Now, most of these forms of divination were frowned upon, at least by the official scribes, the writers of the Bible. I suspect that the average person in the ancient Near East, Israelite, Canaanite, Babylonian, would have thought all this stuff was perfectly okay. In the same way today that people who would consider themselves faithful and religious and good churchgoers or synagogue goers might in fact consult their horoscopes first thing in the morning. Right? I actually do that myself, but I still consider myself quite religiously faithful. I think biblical figures would have done the same thing. Now, let's move from the question of divination to the question of actual prophecy, and where prophecy in its uniquely Israelite sense came about. One explanation, which brings us back to that overextended economy of King Solomon, is that the prophet came about when the office of the judge split into 2, one being the king and one being the conscience of the king. Judges are the system, but by the time we come down to the end of the book of 1 Samuel, we now have kings, and we wind up with Samuel as that king's conscience. As we move on, we have David as king and Nathan as conscience. Here, the prophet is not so much engaging in divinatory practices, and the prophet is not ruling the country. The prophet is telling the king how to rule, both in terms of military function as well as in terms of personal morality. But there's also an alternative view to the separation of the office of the judge. And here we move to etymology, word origins. We've already seen how biblical scholars do that when they search for the origins of Yahwism. Where did that tetragrammaton, those 4 letters, come from? If you look at the letters that spell out the Hebrew word for prophet, the word is Navi. There are two possible etymological origins. One is from the Akkadian to announce, but it's quite vague as to whether this actually works or not. The one that I think probably has the closest meaning is from another Akkadian cognate meaning, in fact, to rave like a mad person. The origin here might be that the prophets in Israel began in terms of ecstatic prophecy. People who were considered possessed by the God, and in that possession either spoke words that were intelligible, political concerns, moral concerns, or spoke words that were completely unintelligible, and then other folks would come along and provide the interpretation. That is, in fact, what happens at the Greek shrine of Delphi, the Delphic oracle. The priestess would sit on a little tripod and noxious fumes would come up and she would simply babble. And the Greek word prophetes, whence we get the English prophet, is actually the man who would interpret her unintelligible utterings. We do have forms of ecstatic prophecy already in the Bible, and in fact, we find them most commonly associated with King Saul. So let's go back to Saul for a minute. In 1 Samuel chapter 10, Saul has just been secretly anointed by Samuel. And Samuel says to him, you're going to meet a band of prophets. And this is what happens. The band of prophets is coming down from the high places with harps and tambourines and lyres and flutes, a lot of musical instruments. And they are prophesying. We are not told what their prophecies are. We do not even know if these prophecies have content. They simply may be singing or making unintelligible sounds to the rhythm of the music. And then we're told, in fact, Saul is told, the Spirit of the Lord, the Ruach, that we already saw back in Genesis chapter 1, the Spirit of God that hovers over the deep. The Ruach, the Spirit of the Lord, will come upon you, and you shall prophesy with them, says Samuel to Saul, and you will be turned into another man. In other words, your own personality will become submerged and a different person will arise. And this is exactly what happens. Saul begins prophesying with this band of prophets. No content here, but prophecy. And therefore the account ends, it became in fact a proverb, is Saul also among the prophets? This is very positive. It's a sign that God approves of Saul's anointing. When we get to 1 Samuel 19, we actually find the same saying as Saul among the prophets, but here in a very negative way. Saul has by now decided that David is his enemy, and Saul is right because David wants the throne. And Saul at one point sends messengers to try to capture David. This is what happens to the messengers. When they saw the company of prophets prophesying and Samuel standing as head over them, the Spirit of God, here Ruach Elohim, overtakes them, and they also prophesied. Now, if you're engaging in this type of ecstatic prophecy, you are in no position to be able to capture somebody who's about to usurp the throne. Saul's messengers can't do what he wants, so Saul appropriately sends another band of messengers. They hook up with the prophets. They start prophesying. Things are not working out too well. A third group grows, and then finally Saul himself goes, and this is how the Bible describes him. Speaking of Saul, he too stripped naked of his clothes, and he too prophesied before Samuel, and lay naked all that night and all that day. Hence it is said, is Saul also among the prophets? The same statement, but two very different contexts within which that statement is placed. And that is, in fact, very, very common in oral traditions, oral cultures. People may well remember a particular phrase, but not remember the content that gave rise to that phrase to begin with. For those of you familiar with the New Testament, we have Jesus quoted as saying, take up your pallet and walk. But Matthew, Mark, and Luke give one particular context for that, and the Gospel of John another. But as you know, that's for a different lecture series. And in terms of ecstatic prophecy, the following example, I think, epitomizes the problem with King Saul. 1 Samuel 18:10 describes Saul as one who raved within his house or engaged in frenzy within his house. This is why David is called upon to play the harp for him, to play the lyre, to soothe his spirit. The Hebrew term for raving here is vayit nabe, which has the root nabi, the root for the Hebrew word prophet. So instead of translating Saul raved within his house, we could even say Saul prophesied within his house. But this is ecstatic prophecy. Saul is uncontrolled. We have examples of ecstatic prophecy elsewhere in the Bible, as well as through the ancient Near East. The Egyptian travels of Wen-Amen, a very well-known and multiply copied tale, talks about God seizing youths and causing them to prophesy. And among non-Hebrews in the biblical text, if we go back to the book of Numbers, we find this spectacular prophet. He's not a Hebrew, he's a prophet for hire. His name is Balaam, and the king of Moab actually hires him to curse the Israelites because prophets have connections with the divine. Balaam, however, is possessed by God, and instead of cursing the Israelite community in the wilderness, he winds up blessing them. The king of Moab complains, "I didn't hire you for this." And Balaam says, "Well, I'm sorry, I can only say the words that God puts into my mouth." And indeed, the irony of ironies here is that Balaam's prophecy is now part of Jewish liturgy. For those of you in the Jewish tradition, you might know the song, Ma Tovu Oha Lecha Ya'akov. This is, "How goodly are your tents, O Jacob, your encampments, O Israel." That's Balaam's blessing, possessed by the God. Ecstatic prophecy could be accomplished not only by divine possession, it could also be accomplished by technology. From a shrine in Anatolia dating to the 5th millennium BCE, archaeologists have recovered opium pipes. And I don't think those priests were smoking just because they enjoyed it. I think they used their opium haze in order to divine, to get the words of the gods. In Ugarit, wine was used. In South and Central America, psilocybin, mushrooms and toad skins. Ecstatic prophecy at Delphi, as we've already seen, and perhaps even through trance or mutilation. When Elijah fights the prophets of Baal on Mount Carmel, we are told that the prophets of Baal cried aloud and cut themselves after their custom with swords and lances until the blood gushed out. They are beside themselves. They are, in fact, in ecstasy. And if you think about the root ecstasy, it simply means ecstasis, to stand outside yourself. That's ecstatic prophecy. And where are we when it comes to biblical prophecy? I suspect that both explanations, the separation of the role of judge into king and prophet, and also ecstatic prophecy combine. I suspect they're already combined in Samuel, whom we've seen is not only the conscience of the king and not only a political functionary, but also the head of a band of prophets. Prophetic bands continued in Israel. We have a very good example of them, not only with the prophet Elijah, but also with Elisha, who, along with many other prophets, follows Elijah in his travels. It's even been suggested that the bands of prophets had particular sigla, such as bald heads. That may explain 2 Kings chapter 2, where we are told that some small boys came out of the city and they jeered at the prophet Elisha, saying, "Go up, you bald head, go up, you bald head," and "go up" meant then more or less what the English equivalent means now. Elisha turned around, and when he saw them, he cursed them in the name of the Lord, and 2 she-bears came out of the woods and tore up 42 of the boys. This is quite nasty, right? Prophets can do miracles, particularly the pre-classical prophet. Is the bald head a sign, a shaven head, a sign of prophecy? It could be. It might also be that Elisha was simply bald. In terms of pre-classical prophets in their formal means, kings hired prophets. Indeed, they hired bands of prophets. So the office of court prophet became quite popular. That's Nathan's job, for example. But eventually, the court prophet would separate from the band and give the king oracles that the king did not want to hear. Epitomizing this is a court prophet from the court of King Ahab, Jezebel's husband. His name is Micaiah ben Imlah. And at one point, King Ahab complains about him so much, he says, "I hate him, for he never prophesies good concerning me, but only evil," right? If the prophet says bad things are going to happen to the king, that's probably a legitimate prophet. And thus we come to Elijah. Elijah, epitomizing the pre-classical prophet, is cast in the role of Moses. For example, Moses has a theophany, a revelation of God on Mount Sinai. Elijah has a revelation of God on Mount Horeb, the e-source's name for Sinai. Elijah performs a sacrifice on Mount Carmel. The entire altar is consumed with fire. The people see this miracle and they bow down and worship God. Moses does exactly the same thing in Leviticus. He offers a sacrifice, thereby consecrates his altar. The fire consumes the offering, and the people bow down. And in the Hebrew, you can see the words being repeated. Like Moses, Elijah has no tomb. Moses, as you know, is buried in secret. For Elijah, a chariot comes down from heaven, a fiery chariot, and takes him back up. And that produces the legends that Elijah will at some point come back. And in our discussion of canon very early in the series, we saw how the Christian canon puts the prophet Malachi at the end, predicting the coming of Elijah. So in terms of Elijah himself, what does he do? What is his role? His task is not easy. He goes up primarily against the king of the north, King Ahab, and his wife Jezebel. Jezebel you probably think of as someone who's like a prostitute, or at least a woman whose morals are suspect. Actually, Jezebel does have her problems. She lies, she steals, she cheats, she engages in libel, she apostatizes, she murders, but she's actually quite faithful to her husband, Ahab. I mean, the one thing she doesn't do is engage in some sort of sexual crime. The reason she gets this reputation is because right before her death, we find in 2 Kings chapter 9, she painted her eyes and adorned her hair, and she stood looking down from the window. This is a woman who knows enough to put on makeup right before she dies. I give her credit for that. Elijah is not only dealing with Ahab's political crimes, he's also dealing with Jezebel's sponsorship of her own gods. Jezebel is from Sidon. She worships one of the Baals. So Elijah has to explain to the people, Baal worship is evil, it's apostatizing, you should only worship the one God. But for the people to whom Elijah is giving these oracles, this did not make much sense. They could not much more conceive of agriculture without Baal as they could conceive of agriculture without rain. Because they're living in a Canaanite environment, and Baal is the nature god. So Elijah has to explain why Baal is simply a false god. He is thereby depicted as contrasting the powers of Yahweh and Baal. In his contest with the priests of Baal on Mount Carmel, he has the priests on Mount Carmel set up one sacrifice, he sets up another, and he says to the priests on Mount Carmel, have your god Baal send fire down and consume the sacrifice. And then you can picture him just kind of sitting there, tapping his foot, flipping his fingers and waiting. And he begins about noontime to taunt the priests of Baal. He says, where is your God? Is he on a journey? Is he meditating? Has he gone aside? And gone aside in Hebrew means, has he gone to the bathroom? Perhaps he's asleep and you have to wake him up. This is taunting the Baal worshipers. And ultimately what we see with Elijah is that his God finally sends down fire from heaven and consumes that sacrifice. Throughout the rest of Elijah's career, he will not only combat Baal worship, he will also establish the model by which future prophets, both pre-classical and classical, find their voice and establish the means by which they can convince the covenant community that their voice is the one that needs to be heeded. Of the prophet Elijah, and indeed of pre-classical prophets in general, we've noticed that often the Deuteronomic historian,
Right. I'll stop there. We kind of jumped ahead by that prophecy tape in the sense that she's giving us insight into the prophets that we'll meet in the next few chapters of Kings as we go. So as you read that portion, now you kind of have a heads up as to what is really going on behind the scenes with these prophets. So moving on from the prophets, now we're going to go to the ending years of King Solomon's reign. In chapters 11 and 12, in response to in response to Solomon's unfaithfulness, God raises three adversaries against him: Hadad from the east, Rezon from the north, and Jeroboam from one of Israel's tribes of Ephraim. Now, I highlighted Jeroboam's name so that you will recognize it as you're reading, and also because it's very similar to the name that comes next, so that you're aware that they look sort of alike, especially the ending of the name's spelling, and don't try not to get them too confused. Well, through these adversaries, God destabilizes the peace that Solomon had established within Israel and at her borders, and this led to the division of the kingdom. And following the death of Solomon, Rehoboam became the king of Israel. Ancient Near East monarchies typically would practice primogeniture succession. That is the right for the oldest son or eldest son to succeed to the throne. Even though that didn't happen with Solomon, but it would have been the normal procedure that the eldest son would become the next heir to the throne. So that is a way of determining who the next ruler will be, but it did not ensure that the position was given to the best candidate, as was the case with Rehoboam. The contrast between Solomon's judgment, which was wise, and Rehoboam's folly further emphasizes Rehoboam had many shortcomings. Another rebel leader was Jeroboam, son of Nebat. Now, this is Jeroboam, the same one I highlighted earlier, is one of Solomon's own officials. He came from the town of Zeradah in Ephraim, Ephraim being one of the northern tribes, and his mother was Zeruiah, a widow. Now, Jeroboam represented the northern tribes and was met by the prophet Ahijah, and he was anointed and told the reasons he would become the king. Jeroboam was one of the overseers for Solomon's projects. So earlier when we talked about the expansiveness of Solomon's kingdom, Jeroboam was one of those trusted high officials who was a supervisor. So this is how the story goes. So one day as Jeroboam was leaving Jerusalem, the prophet Ahijah from Shiloh met him along the way. Ahijah was wearing a new cloak. The two of them were alone in a field, and Ahijah took hold of this new cloak he was wearing and he tore it into 12 pieces, which we know means it represents the 12 tribes. And then he said to Jeroboam, "Take 10 of these pieces, for this is what the Lord, the God of Israel, says. I am about to tear the kingdom from the hand of Solomon, and I will give 10 of the tribes to you. But I will leave him one tribe for the sake of my servant David and for the sake of Jerusalem, which I have chosen out of all the tribes of Israel. For Solomon has abandoned me and worshipped Ashtoreth, the goddess of the Sidonians, Shamash, the god of Moab, and Molech, the god of the Ammonites. He has not followed my ways and done what is pleasing in my sight. He has not obeyed my decrees and regulations as David, his father, did." So there we see the anointing in secret in a field away from Jerusalem of the next king for the northern tribes. So now Jeroboam knows he will be king, but not yet. So the transition is near, even though the anointing was done secretly. Most likely Solomon received word of it, because then he tried to kill Jeroboam. And Jeroboam sought refuge in Egypt and waited for the king Solomon's death. Jeroboam was anxious to assume control. In the next chapters, we'll see the reasons Israel now divides into two separate units, the northern and southern kingdoms of Israel and Judah. This is a chart of the divided kings of Israel. We start out with the first king, Saul, David, who unites the kingdom, Solomon, who has his 40 years of glorious reign. Then at the end of Solomon's reign, we see it divides into the north and south. And we'll list the names of the kings on each side of the chart for north and south. And each of them had about 20 kings, even though their times didn't coincide. As a total, there were about 20 kings for each. And I'm handing out a chart. This is very hard to see, I realize, on an overhead or a screen. But on this chart, we see the kings and the prophets of Israel and Judah. Again, it is separated to where we have Israel on one side and Judah on the other. But what I wanted to show on this particular chart is that as we go along, we see the different prophets that fit into the same timeline with these kings and coincide during their rule. So we'll come across them and some of their teachings while we are going through these books of Kings. Now we see minor and major prophets. The major prophets are dressed in the dark robes, and the minor prophets are in the white or clear robes. And basically the major prophets have longer writings or more pages of writings, like Isaiah has 66 books. Jeremiah has his book Jeremiah plus the book of Lamentations. And Ezekiel has a fairly large book, and Daniel is a book of I can't think of the word, apocalyptic predictions. And so we'll get to that in the future as well. So suggested reading for next week is 1 Kings 12 through 16, Psalm 9 and 10, which originally were one psalm in the Hebrew writings. And if you can read this in the Message version, it will be much easier to understand. In the future, I just wanted to put up how I am dividing these units of study. So this week I highlighted, we have the 1 Kings chapters 12 through 16. Next week we'll transition over to 1 Kings and into 2 Kings and so on. And then at the end, when we get to the discussion about Assyria and the division and the exile, I'll show you some of the history of the Assyrian Empire so you can understand that as well. So just to kind of wind it up, I want to give you this little overview of the first book of Kings, or both books of Kings.
The books of First and Second Kings. Although they're two separate books in our Bibles, they were originally written as one book telling a unified story that continues on from the book of Samuel that came before it. So David has unified the tribes of Israel into a kingdom, and God promised that from his line would come a messianic king who would establish God's kingdom over the nations and fulfill the promises made to Abraham. So the book of Kings tells the story of the long line of kings that came after David, and none of them lived up to that promise. In fact, they run the nation of Israel right into the ground. The book is designed to have 5 main movements. The story begins and ends focus on Jerusalem, first with Solomon's reign and the construction of the temple, and then in this last section ending with Jerusalem's destruction and Israel's exile to Babylon. And the story leading up to this tragedy is what makes up the center 3 sections, which explain how Israel split into 2 rival kingdoms, how God tried to prevent the corruption of Israel by sending the prophets, and how exile became the unavoidable consequence of Israel's sin. The book opens with 2 chapters about the kingdom passing from the aging David to his son Solomon. And David's final words to Solomon, they're very similar to those of Moses and Joshua and Samuel to the people. It's a call to remain faithful to the commands of the covenant and to give allegiance to the God of Israel alone. But David's words ring somewhat hollow here, because David and Solomon then go on to conspire how they're going to consolidate this new kingdom through a whole series of political assassinations. It's not off to a great start. Solomon's brightest moment comes when he asks God for wisdom to lead Israel, and he even completes David's dream to make a temple for the God of Israel. Here the story actually stops and describes the design of this temple in detail, just like the tabernacle design in the Torah. There's all these gold and jewels and depictions of angels and fruit trees. It's all symbolism echoing back to the Garden of Eden. It's the place where heaven and earth meet, where God's presence dwells with his people. But no sooner does Solomon finish the temple that he makes some really horrible choices and the kingdom falls apart. He starts marrying the daughters of other kings, hundreds of them, for political alliances. And then he adopts their gods and introduces the worship of those gods into Israel. Solomon then accumulates huge amounts of wealth. He builds a huge army. He even institutes slave labor for all of his building projects. Now, if you go back to the Torah and look at God's guidelines for Israel's kings in Deuteronomy 17, Solomon is breaking every one. So by the time that he dies, Solomon resembles Pharaoh, the king of Egypt, more than he does his father David. The next section of the book opens with Solomon's son, Rehoboam, acting just like his father. It's a very sad story of greed and lust for power. He tries to increase taxes for slave labor. And under the leadership of Jeroboam, the northern tribes reject this, they rebel and secede, and form their own rival kingdom. And so now in the story, you have the southern kingdom, Judah, centered in Jerusalem with kings from the line of David, and now this new northern kingdom called Israel, whose capital will be Samaria eventually. Jeroboam also goes on to build 2 new temples to compete with Solomon's temple in the south. He puts a golden calf in each one to represent the God of Israel. The connection to Exodus 32 and the golden calf, it's all quite explicit. From this point on, the story goes back and forth from north to south, tracing the fate of both kingdoms. Each one had about 20 successive kings, and as the author introduces each king, he evaluates their reign by a few criteria. Did they worship the God of Israel alone, or did they promote the worship of other gods? Did they deal with idolatry among the people? And did they remain faithful to the covenant like David, or do they become corrupt and unjust? And according to these criteria, the author finds no good kings in northern Israel, 0 for 20. And then in southern Judah, only 8 out of 20 get a positive rating, which connects to another huge purpose in this book, and that's to introduce the role of the prophets, key figures in Israel's history. So in the Bible, prophets were not fortune tellers. Rather, they spoke on behalf of the God of Israel, and they played the role of covenant watchdogs, which means they called out idolatry and injustice among the kings and the people. They were constantly reminding Israel of their calling to be a light to the nations, that they should obey the commands of the Torah, and so the prophets challenged Israel to repent and follow their God. In these center sections for each king, God then raises up prophets to hold them accountable. And the most prominent prophets are the northern ones, Elijah and his disciple Elisha, right here in the center of the book. Elijah was a wild man of a prophet living out in the desert, and his arch-nemesis was the northern king Ahab and his Canaanite wife Jezebel. Together, these two had instituted the worship of the Canaanite god Baal over Israel. And so in a famous story, Elijah challenged 450 prophets of Baal to a contest to see which god was real. So they both built altars and prayed to their gods, but only the God of Israel answers with fire. After this, Ahab uses his royal power to murder an Israelite farmer and then steal his family's vineyard. And Elijah again confronts Ahab's injustice, and he announces the downfall of his house. Elijah eventually passes the mantle of his prophetic leadership to a young disciple named Elisha, who asks for 2 times the authority of Elijah. And what's fascinating here is how the author, he's recounted 7 miraculous feats for Elijah, and then he offers stories of 14 acts of power from Elijah. Both prophets were clearly remarkable men, and they played the same role, confronting Israel's kings for idolatry and injustice. And ultimately, they were unsuccessful in turning Israel back from apostasy. In the next section, the northern kingdom is rocked by a bloody revolution started by a king named Jehu, who destroys Ahab's family. And although Jehu was at first commissioned by God, his violence just gets out of control, and it creates the spiral of political assassinations and rebellions from which Israel never recovered. Coup follows coup after Jehu, and each king follows other gods, allows horrible injustice. It all leads up to 2 Kings chapter 17. The big bad empire of Assyria swoops down and takes out the northern kingdom altogether. In the capital city of Samaria, it's conquered, and the Israelites are exiled and scattered throughout the ancient world. Now, chapter 17 is key. The author stops the story and offers this prophetic reflection on what's just happened. He blames the downfall of the northern kingdom on the idolatry and covenant unfaithfulness of Israel and its kings. And so, God has allowed them to face the consequences of their decisions. The final movement of the book tells the story of the lone southern kingdom. And here we meet some very heroic kings, like Hezekiah, who trusts God when the armies of Assyria come knocking on Jerusalem's door, or Josiah, who discovers this lost scroll of the Torah in the temple. So he starts reading it, he's convicted, and he institutes religious reforms to remove idolatry and Canaanite influences from the land. But Judah is just too far gone. The king, right in between these two, Manasseh, he's the worst by far. So he not only introduces the worship of idol statues into the Jerusalem temple, he also institutes child sacrifice. And so God sends prophets to say, the time is up. Israel has reached the point of no return. The final chapters tell the story of the Babylonian Empire coming to invade Jerusalem, destroy the temple, and carry the people and the royal line of David off into exile. And so the story ends leaving us wondering, is God done with Israel? Is he done with the line of David? Well, the final paragraph zooms about 40 years forward into the exile, and it tells a very odd story. It's about Jehoiakim, a descendant from David, who would have been king if he was back in Jerusalem. And the king of Babylon releases him from prison and invites him to eat at the royal table for the rest of his life, and the book ends. So it's not much, but it's a story that gives a glimmer of hope that God has not abandoned the line of David. So the question now is, how is God going to fulfill his promises to Abraham, to David? How is he going to bless the nations and bring the Messianic kingdom? And to answer those questions, you have to read on into the wisdom and the prophetic books. But for now, that's the Book of Kings.
All right. So here we have our summary and overview for the entire books of 1st and 2nd Kings. I think it gives you a good view of what you'll be reading in the next section, or several sections, as we get to the end of the unit. All right, so let's close up this lesson with a poem. And this one is called Let Your God Love You by Edwina Gately. A thought-provoking poem, and makes me think of meditation. Be silent, be still, alone, empty before your God. Say nothing, ask nothing, be silent, be still. Let your God look upon you. That is all. God knows. God understands. God loves you with an enormous love and only wants to look upon you with that love. Quiet, still, be. Let your God love you. Have a wonderful week.